Chapter 3: The Origin of Repressive Civilization. Phylogenesis. The quest for the origin of repression leads back to the origin of instinctual repression, which occurs during early childhood. The superego is the heir of the Oedipus complex, and the repressive organization of sexuality is chiefly directed against its pregenital and perverse manifestations. Moreover, the trauma of birth releases the first expressions of the death instinct, the impulse to return to the nirvana of the womb, and necessitates the subsequent controls of this impulse. It is in the child that the reality principle completes its work, with such thoroughness and severity that the mature individual's behavior is hardly more than a repetitive pattern of childhood experiences and reactions. But the childhood experiences which become traumatic under the impact of reality are pre-individual, generic. With individual variations, the protracted dependence of the human infant, the Oedipus situation, and pregenital sexuality all belong to the genus man. Moreover, the unreasonable severity of the superego of the neurotic personality, the unconscious sense of guilt, and the unconscious need for punishment seem to be out of proportion with the actual, sinful impulses of the individual. The perpetuation, and, as we shall see, intensification of the sense of guilt throughout maturity, the excessively repressive organization of sexuality, cannot be adequately explained in terms of the still acute danger of individual impulses. Nor can the individual reactions to early traumata be adequately explained by what the individual himself has experienced. They deviate from individual experiences in a way that would accord much better with their being reactions to genetic events, and in general they can be explained only through such an influence. The analysis of the mental structure of the personality is thus forced to regress behind early childhood, from the prehistory of the individual to that of the genus. In the personality, according to Otto Rank, there operates a biological sense of guilt, which stands for the demands of the species. The moral principles which the child imbibes from the persons responsible for its upbringing during the first years of its life reflect certain phylogenetic echoes of primitive man. End quote. Civilization is still determined by its archaic heritage, and this heritage, so Freud asserts, includes not only dispositions, but also ideational contents, memory traces of the experiences of former generations. Individual psychology is thus in itself group psychology, insofar as the individual itself still is an archaic identity with the species. This archaic heritage bridges the gap between individual and mass psychology. The conception has far-reaching implications for the method and substance of social science. As psychology tears the ideological veil and traces the construction of the personality, it is led to dissolve the individual. His autonomous personality appears as the frozen manifestation of the general repression of mankind. Self-consciousness and reason, which have conquered and shaped the historical world, have done so in the image of repression, internal and external. They have worked as the agents of domination. The liberties which they have brought, and these are considerable, grew in the soil of enslavement and have retained the mark of their birth. These are the disturbing implications of Freud's theory of the personality. By dissolving the idea of the ego personality into its primary components, psychology now bears the sub-individual and pre-individual factors which, largely unconscious to the ego, actually make the individual. It reveals the power of the universal in and over the individuals. This disclosure undermines one of the strongest ideological fortifications of modern culture, namely the notion of the autonomous individual. Freud's theory here joins the great critical efforts to dissolve ossified sociological concepts into their historical content. His psychology does not focus on the concrete and complete personality as it exists in its private and public environment, because this existence conceals rather than reveals the essence and the nature of the personality. It is the end result of long historical processes which are congealed in the network of human and institutional entities making up society, and these processes define the personality and its relationships. Consequently, to understand them for what they really are, psychology must unfreeze them by tracing their hidden origins. In doing so, psychology discovers that the determining childhood experiences are linked with the experiences of the species, that the individual lives in the universal fate of mankind. The past defines the present because mankind has not yet mastered its own history. To Freud, the universal fate is in the instinctual drives, but they are themselves subject to historical modifications. At their beginning is the experience of domination, symbolized by the primal father, the extreme Oedipus situation. It is not entirely overcome. The mature ego of the civilized personality still preserves the archaic heritage of man. If this dependency of the ego is not kept in mind, the increased emphasis in Freud's later writings on the autonomy of the mature ego might be abused as justification for abandoning the most advanced conceptions of psychoanalysis, a retreat undertaken by the cultural and interpersonal schools. In one of his last papers, Freud proposes that not all modifications of the ego are acquired. During the defensive conflicts of early childhood, he suggests that each individual ego is endowed from the beginning with its own peculiar dispositions and tendencies, that there exist primary congenital variations in the ego. However, this new autonomy of the ego seems to turn into its opposite. Far from retracting the notion of the ego's essential dependency on pre-individual generic constellations, Freud strengthens the role of these constellations in the development of the ego, for he interprets the congenital variations of the ego in terms of our archaic knowledge, and he thinks that, even before the ego exists, its subsequent lines of development, tendencies, and reactions are already determined. End quote. Indeed, the apparent renaissance of the ego is accompanied by the accentuation of the deposits from primitive human development present in our archaic heritage. When Freud concludes from the congenital structure of the ego that the topographical differentiation between ego and id loses much of its value for our investigation, then the assimilation of ego and id seems to alter the balance between the two mental forces in favor of the id rather than the ego, the generic rather than the individual processes. No part of Freud's theory has been more strongly rejected than the idea of the survival of the archaic heritage. His reconstruction of the prehistory of mankind from the primal horde through patricide to civilization. The difficulties in scientific verification and even in logical consistency are obvious and perhaps insurmountable. Moreover, they are reinforced by the taboos which the Freudian hypothesis so effectively violates. It does not lead back to the image of a paradise which man has forfeited by his sin against God, but to the domination of man by man, established by a very earthly father-despot and perpetuated by the unsuccessful or uncompleted rebellion against him. The original sin was against man, and it was no sin because it was committed against one who was himself guilty. And this phylogenetic hypothesis reveals that mature civilization is still conditioned by archaic mental immaturity. The memory of prehistoric impulses and deeds continues to haunt civilization. The repressed material returns, and the individual is punished for impulses long since mastered and deeds long since undone. If Freud's hypothesis is not corroborated by any anthropological evidence, it would have to be discarded altogether except for the fact that it telescopes, in a sequence of catastrophic events, the historical dialectic of domination and thereby elucidates aspects of civilization hitherto unexplained. We use Freud's anthropological speculation only in this sense, for its symbolic value. The archaic events that the hypothesis stipulates may forever be beyond the realm of anthropological verification. The alleged consequences of these events are historical facts, and their interpretation in the light of Freud's hypothesis lends them a neglected significance which points to the historical future. If the hypothesis defies common sense, it claims in its defiance a truth which common sense has been trained to forget. In Freud's construction, the first human group was established and sustained by the enforced rule of one individual over all others. At one time in the life of the genus, man, life was organized by domination, and the man who succeeded in dominating the others was the father. That is to say, the man who possessed the desired woman and who had, with him, produced and kept alive the sons and daughters. The father monopolized for himself the woman, the supreme pleasure, and subjugated the other members of the horde to his power. Did he succeed in establishing his dominion because he succeeded in excluding them from supreme pleasure? In any case, for the group as a whole, the monopolization of pleasure meant an unequal distribution of pain. Quote, the fate of the sons was a hard one. If they excited the father's jealousy, they were killed or castrated or driven out. They were forced to live in small communities and to provide themselves with wives by stealing them from others. End quote. The burden of whatever work had to be done in the primal horde would have been placed on the sons who, by their exclusion from the pleasure reserved for the father, had now become free of the channeling of instinctual energy into unpleasurable but necessary activities. The constraint on the gratification of instinctual needs imposed by the father, the suppression of pleasure, thus not only was the result of domination but also created the mental preconditions for the continued functioning of domination.